Hi, this is Márcia from Lut Studios. In this video, I will paint the armor of this awesome miniature in 75mm scale, Alexandra Uthgarde, the paladin hero from our It's Another Trap bundle. I will do a technique called non-metallic metal, or NMM, which is basically painting with only acrylic paints and making a very cool effect simulating metal. Let's go! First, I'm going to show you some examples to understand metal and help us with the painting process. Looking at those old paintings, the painters didn't use metallic paint, it wasn't available. Even so, we can feel that some objects are really metal, right? If you understand how the light interacts with metal, we can make this illusion in many ways, including minis. Here we have a photo of real armor. Again, it is very clear the difference between metal and other materials. Comparing different metals, we can see that the lightest parts are super bright and the shadows very dark. This is the most important thing when you are painting metal. High contrast. It's because metal is very reflective. When the metal catches light, it will shine very bright, almost white, and where there isn't light, the metal will be very dark, almost black or black. Another very important point is to make a smooth gradient between the light and shadows, especially with one metal. Here we can see a clear difference between a rogue and a very polished metal. The rogue one looks metallic, but the gradients are very smooth, while the polished one we see very defined reflections. You can even see the other sphere reflected, with hard transitions between light and shadow. Both ways are realistic, but for minis I highly recommend you to paint metals that look a little more polished. Painting like this, your metallic parts will look much more interesting. When painting minis or in other art forms, you don't necessarily need to chase a hyper-realistic look. In most cases, you can see the reality and represent it in a much more beautiful and interesting way. When you paint a battle-damaged metal, for example, you can make it more polished than it should be to emphasize it is metal, but with some scratches and dirt on top of it to make sure it looks old. Metal also reflects the environment, but as it is a curved or a contoured mirror, this reflection is distorted. It's a nice effect to paint and makes the paint very interesting. But yes, it's hard. I have never tried. Before we start painting Alexandra's armor, let me show you some images and explain a simpler way to think while you are painting metal, so you can paint any object. For our first example, I use this sphere that we rendered using a 3D software. A sphere is a very good shape to understand how reflection works. Even being a very simple render, we can feel this sphere is metallic because of how reflective it is. Let's imagine this sphere is placed in an outdoor environment during a sun day. Here we have three main elements: the sun, which is the light source, the sky, and the floor. Now, it is important to notice the position of these elements on the sphere and understand why it looks like this. It is actually very simple. Imagine you are looking straight forward to this sphere. Now, look at a specific point on its surface and try to imagine to what direction this point is facing. If it is facing up, you probably will see the sky's reflection. If it is facing down, you will see the floor. At the center area, you can see the horizon. For the sun, you can see it is in the sky, obviously, and on the left side from our perspective. When painting metal objects, like armors, to simplify the shapes and imagine them as spheres is a very good and simple way to know where to place the lights and shadows. However, it is important to show some examples when things change a little. If you see this concave object, all the reflections are reversed. The floor is reflected on the upper area, while the sky and sun are on the bottom. Again, if we choose each point and imagine where they are facing, we will see that the bottom is facing the sky. So, when making concave objects, pay attention to this. If you paint it like you would do on a sphere, it will look very weird. Another good example are cylindrical objects. When painting leg armor, thinking of a cylinder is a very good way of simplifying things. The logic here is the same. If the area is facing up, you will see the sky and sun. However, because of their geometry, cylindrical objects tend to reflect the environment in a very stretched way. In the image, you can see that the sun looks like a line, not a point. So, when painting shapes like this, using lines for light and shadows is a good direction. As our last example, I chose some different objects. The important point to note here is that not all objects have simple reflections like a sphere. This happens because this peanut-shaped object has two regions that are facing up. With this third object, this simple monkey head, we can see a lot of smaller sun reflections, as there are a lot of areas facing this direction. So, when painting minis, pay attention to that. Try to simplify complex objects into simple shapes, but don't forget to notice all areas that are facing up or down. Okay, I already talked too much. Let's start painting. Just keep in mind that everything I said and showed is just to help you understand how reflection works. When painting, you don't have to be so precise. Just have fun and try to make a cool looking mini. So, with Alexandra in hand, I will start by applying a black primer. I will take advantage of that primer to create shadows. So, I want to use the zenithal primer technique by applying white primer over the black. I think it's faster and we get a more homogeneous result when applying primer with an airbrush. But at the rest, I will paint only using brushes. I choose a point of view so that NMM works well. From this point of view, I imagine the light source. We can see that my lamp's on lightning is illuminating and creating volume on the piece. And I'm going to think of a daylight coming from a direction like that, coming from above and from my left side, placing light colors in these regions. Here in my wet palette, I have black and pale gray colors. I'm mixing them to create a gradient. First, I'm going to mark the regions that receive light, or that are reflecting the sky. Remember to simplify the formats. I consider the shoulder as a sphere, the leg armor as cylinders, and I try to create light and reflection following this logic that has already been explained. And I keep lighting gradually, reducing the area and increasing the contrast between light and shadow. Always trying to figure out which areas are facing up and which areas are facing down. With this same color, more diluted, as in a glazy consistency, I applied the paint smoothing the transitions between this dark gray and the black primer. The more smooth, the more refined your paint will look. I keep lightening and reinforcing the edges. As the last process using the previous color very diluted, I'm smoothing transitions. I will do it every time I think it's necessary. Sometimes I use the previous color, sometimes something darker or lighter. Here, I'm mixing pale sands with pale gray to highlight even more the edges and the most illuminated areas. And I will use an almost pure white color to increase the light in specific points. For that, I paint with lines or dots. These lighter dots represent the sun or light source reflection. Now, I'm trying to make an environmental reflection using shades of blue to represent sky reflection and green and brown to represent where she is, as ground, trees. So, in the regions that I imagined might be reflecting the sky, I applied a very diluted blue. While the face is pointed to the ground, I applied shades of brown. I think I need to increase the gray region, reducing the shadow part a little. I add more shades of gray and the colors of the reflections. I'm trying to get better. Note that I'm considering the scales as small spheres, leaving a shadow and a point of light. The chest armor is very complex, it has a lot of details. So, again, I try to simplify things and imagine that each shape on it is a different object with areas facing up and down. For the golden parts, I start applying the middle stone color mixed with black and the dark flesh tone. Little by little, I lighten up. I apply golden yellow, and yellow mixed with luminous flesh. A very important property of the other colored metals, unlike silver ones, is that they don't reflect the colors of the environment. They reflect light with the same tone as the metal. So in this case, the reflections of the golden areas of the armor will be yellowish. No blue sky reflections here. In this image, you can see a very popular way to paint swords and other weapons blades. It isn't necessarily realistic, but it looks very cool. On one side, paint a gradient between light and dark, and on the other side, paint the opposite. I add brown and green tones on the side facing down, and on the side facing up, I apply a little blue. In the same way, I'm always applying a color and smoothing the transition. I'm infusing shadow with pure black to increase contrast and look more like metal. To finish, I reinforce the edge and the dividing line between the two sides of the sword with white. A cool tip to have precision when painting the edges of sharp objects is to use the side of the brush, not the tip. painting just a detail on the feet, enhancing contrast and make the light thinner. And that's it. I'm feeling the need to finish it, to paint the skin and fabrics to visualize it as a whole. So I will stop here. That's it, guys. I hope you liked this video. See you in the next one. Bye bye.